When you read the Old Testament, you eventually come across passages that are shocking, to say the least. Verses where God commands the complete and total destruction of a nation, all the men, women, and children within it. It sounds like a genocide, and it raises a tough question. Is the God of the Bible a moral monster? If you've ever wrestled with that, you're not alone. But what if the story is a bit more complex than it seems? In this video, that's what we're going to tackle head on by looking at these passages directly, looking and understanding their context, seeing how the biblical narrative itself adds important details to understanding and applying these passages today. So let's get into the text. To start, let's just be honest and read the command itself that we're talking about. This is from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. It says, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations," it continues then, it says, "then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy." That language is pretty absolute. And it's repeated in the book in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 and 18, where a reason is also given. Here it says, "However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them." It continues, "As the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God." So this text is pretty clear. It doesn't leave room. This is the command. It uses these phrases like destroy them totally, do not leave anything that breathes. This is the difficult part that we have to start with, we have to dive into. The key isn't just to ignore this passage and move on, but to ask the next question that comes to mind, which is, why is this command really being given? The Bible frames this as a conquest, not of just random violence, but as a specific judgment that God is doing through the nation of Israel. The text gives its own reasoning. So let's start with Leviticus chapter 18, verse 21, and then we'll read 24 and 25 as well. Here it says in verse 21, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech." This was a god. "For if you must not profane the name, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants." This theme is repeated again in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 31, which describes the practices of the nations in the land. This further drives this point forward. It says, "Must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire as a sacrifice to their gods." So here we see both passages explicitly mention things like child sacrifice, burning their sons and daughters in the fire as a primary reason for this judgment, among, I'm sure, many other sins that were being committed by these nations. The text presents the conquest not just as an issue of race or nation against nation for the sake of it, but really as a conquest for these specific destructive behaviors that had reached a boiling point, and God was choosing to judge these nations. So then let's talk about the language itself that's being used here. Something really interesting is that archaeologists and historians know that in ancient Near East military accounts, they often were written in sweeping hyperbolic language, which means that a king might claim to have utterly wiped out an enemy, but then we later find evidence that that people group or that nation was still around for centuries afterwards. And the even more interesting part is that we see this evidence in the Bible directly. So let's look at this sweeping summary statement in Joshua chapter 10, verse 40. It says, "So Joshua subdued the whole region. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded." Sounds pretty final. He left no survivors, it says. But then if you keep reading into the very next book of the Bible, the book of Judges, you see a different picture. And so let's read from Judges chapter 1. In verse 21, it says, "The Benjamites," which was a tribe of Israel, "did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem." This was a part of the region. "To this day, the Jebusites live there with the Benjamites." Verse 28 and verse 29 continue this. "When Israel became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, but did not drive them out completely. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer, but the Canaanites continued to live there among them." So this is key. The book of Joshua says he left no survivors, but then the book of Judges immediately shows that many of these groups were still living right there among the Israelites. So this contrasts strongly, suggesting that the language in Joshua was a standard military rhetoric of that day, not necessarily saying that it was total 100% annihilation of the people, but it was a decisive and total victory over them. So does this really make the story easy to read? I would argue personally no. But it does show a big difference in this story, showing that God is a moral monster, that he's commanding genocide, and that he is actually a God who is just, who is judging a nation for their sin, for child sacrifice, which I would argue is very wrong. It's a violent time in history, and that's what we're seeing a picture into. It's very important to understand the whole story, to know exactly what we're reading, and not just pick a verse out and then make a judgment call about the God of the Bible, the God of the Old Testament, and make these claims about God as a moral monster, as a God who commands genocide, who is unjust, when we look at it, it's actually quite the opposite. He's a God who is just. He's a God who does care about the nations, and he sees their sin. And because he's a God who's just, he actually will judge their sin. And he does the same thing with the nation of Israel. Later on in the Old Testament, if you continue reading, the nation of Israel is then judged for its sin and sent into captivity because of it. So he's not a God who is partial towards just Israel. He also later judges them for their sin, just in a different time. So if you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening. Let's continue this conversation. There's so much more that could be talked about. There's so much that I probably didn't get into or accidentally left out. So let's continue talking about this. This is a tough question. It's something to wrestle with. And let's make sure we're not just taking a verse and taking it out of context. Let's understand the story we're reading.